Okay, I think we have a critical mass, so we're going. My name is Chet Kerr. I'm a member of the board of the Irvington Historical Society, and I want to welcome everybody here today. We're going to be hearing from Professor Edward O'Donnell. I just want to let everybody know that we're going to be doing a question and answer session at the end of Professor O'Donnell's talk. And if people have questions, they should put them into the chat. And so you can put them in the chat as you go along, or we can wait to the end. But once Professor O'Donnell's presentation is over, we will then turn to those questions and answer sessions and hopefully get a chance to respond to people's questions. So with that, I'm going to turn the screen over to Veronica Gedrich, who is the Irvington Historical Society president, to more formally welcome everybody here today. So Veronica, you're on.
Hi, everybody. Glad you could join us today. We're delighted to welcome Edward O'Donnell, Associate Professor and Chair of the History Department at the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts. Professor O'Donnell is a professional historian, author, speaker, teacher, and podcaster. His publications and public presentations are extensive. Two of his books, Henry George and the Crisis of Inequality, and Ship Ablaze, The Tragedy of the Steamboat General Slocum, are terrific reads. As a professional speaker, he has delivered history-themed presentations before thousands of educational, business, and nonprofit organizations. During his years in New York City, he also led more than 1,200 walking tours through New York City's ethnic neighborhoods, such as Chinatown, Little Italy, and Harlem. He's contributed to programs on TV and radio stations, including PBS, the History Channel, the Discovery Channel, and NPR. He has curated several major museum exhibits on American history and appeared in a number of historical documentaries. He was an advisor on the Irish apartment exhibit at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum. He also has created video lecture courses on American history for the teaching company, including Turning Points in American History and America in the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. I could go on much longer, but I'm sure we're all eager to hear his presentation. So, Professor O'Donnell, if you're ready.
All right. I am ready. Let me share my screen. All right. And I guess if you could just tell me, I guess I'm assuming everybody can see my screen. Is that right?
That's correct. Looks good.
Good. Good. Just wanted to make sure. I didn't want to start up with my screen looking good, but you guys not having anything to see. All right, great. Well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And this is a lot of fun. Thank you all for, giving up a portion of your beautiful Sunday afternoon. You could have gone to the beach or to the pool or somewhere else, but and there's still plenty of time in the rest of the day to do a little of that. So we'll make the most of it. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart because I've studied and I teach, and I've written a lot about the Gilded Age. And as I often point out, it's a time period, unfortunately, in some ways, that is incredibly relevant to our current moment. So anyway, let's just jump in right away with the way that I always start my presentations, or often anyway, which is to first, before we get into the content, to just kind of think about history. Like, what the heck is history, and what are some ways to think about teaching, understanding, studying history? One is the study of conflict, thinking of history as the study of conflict. And some of that conflict is the stuff that comes to mind, like wars and revolutions and insurrections, strikes, but it's also, so it does include that, but also it includes conflict over ideas, conflict over visions, like where are we as a society going to go? What should we do? And if you just think about any moment in American history, it's a conflict, right? The ones that come to mind, should the colonies bind together and break away from the mother country? Should women get the right to vote? Should America enter the Second World War? On and on and on. These are all conflicts. And in our own time, or let's put it this way, 100 years hence, people are going to look back to our period and say, wow, they were really fighting about universal health care and the environment and a lot of other things. So one way to think about it. Another thing to concentrate on when you think about history is this idea of agency, which just simply means people exerting their will to accomplish something, whether an individual or in the case of history, it can be the individual. So we think about powerful people like Franklin Roosevelt or Andrew Carnegie, but also just nameless, faceless people, people who will never really know who they were, but they were part of a movement, whether it was the abolitionist movement, the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, and so forth, moving history by joining these organizations. We tend to know the big people, but we have to remember that Martin Luther King accomplishes nothing without thousands and thousands of people moving the movement along. He's the leader in many ways, but he's able to do what he does because he's able to mobilize people. So agency is really important. Choices. History is the study of choices. One reason why some folks, unfortunately, think history is boring is they think that it's obvious, that things are inevitable. They just happen. And the moment you change that thinking and say, wait a minute, every moment of history is, marked by choices by large groups of people, but also choices by individuals, presidents, inventors, revolutionaries, and so on. And we can think about, when you think of history as, a study of choices, it is, you really see the drama and you also see the morality, right? Dropping the atomic bomb. That's not an inevitability, that's a choice. And then those choices lead to other, unforeseen consequences and so forth. And then finally, history needs to be relevant, right? It can be this wonderful dive back into the past and reading about amazing events and people and tragedies and so forth. Many people love history in that way, but history in that way, it doesn't really serve any purpose other than to entertain. And so truly history to be significant, to be real and to be effective, it's about now. Every historians are fond of saying everything has a history, and we mean everything, like the fork on your table. There's a whole history behind the invention of the fork and the pockets that you have in your clothing. There's a whole history behind that, as well as institutions or like slavery and so forth. So everything has a history and it connects to the present day. And we'll talk about that at the end as well. So let's dive into the content, which is the Gilded Age. Quick little definition. Gilded Age doesn't have a firm beginning and end point. The end point typically is about 1900, but the beginning point, you'll see some books and some, documentaries and things on the Gilded Age that say 1865, 1870, 1876. And that's roughly, I always say, the last third of the 19th century. It's the easiest way to think about it. And the name comes from a novel written by one of the great figures of the Gilded Age, Mark Twain, The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today. And it's a tale of corruption and scams and really a lot of nefarious characters, and historians love this term, at least many of them, I certainly do, because it's a great metaphor, right? It's, if you look at something that's gilded, like a gilded bracelet, it looks beautiful, it looks like it's gold, it's shiny, it has actual gold on it, but if it was a piece of iron that was dipped in gold, that means if you scratch the surface, beneath the beauty and the shimmer and the wealth of that surface gold, you see the cold, hard iron below. And so it's a great metaphor to say, yeah, the Gilded Age is a stunning age of gold, age of amazing things, but just below the surface, there's a lot of problematic things occurring that are going to really bother people and call out for some kind of solutions. And to sort of set the table for that, here are some things to think about. In the Gilded Age, people were asking these questions. Is industrialization, which is bringing all this wonderful stuff, compatible with republicanism, with Republican government, with democracy? And we've been conditioned over a century since that time to think of, almost to think of democracy and capitalism as going hand in hand. But first of all, that's not true. And second of all, in the late 19th century, as industrialization was unfolding as a new thing, many people said, well, at least in its current form, this is a threat to republicanism, a threat to democracy. Another big question, sort of a big, broad question, was, as people wrestled with the challenges of the Gilded Age and all these new developments, which is more important if we list American values? What's more important, freedom or equality? They are very much, these are values. If you asked Americans, like, what are the top 10 American values? Freedom and equality, and a couple of other values would show up in almost everybody's top 10 list, but ranking them and also deciding which one has supremacy, that's where all the fun, that's where the fights begin. And then another broader question is, okay, if the capitalist economy seems to be in some way problematic, maybe we can fix it. But if we fix it, are we going to kill it? Because it's this amazing economy that's generating all this wealth and all this new technology. Can we regulate it to tame it a little bit without snuffing it out? All right. So with those questions in mind, let's think about the Gilded Age as a great age of dualities, right? A great age of, tensions. And so it's, on the one hand, a age of extraordinary optimism, and we'll get into the details of that in a moment. And then we'll switch gears and scratch the gold to get down below the surface to see it's an age of tremendous anxiety, great fears about where the country's going, is democracy done, etc. So let's first take a look at the age of optimism. What are people saying, and why are they saying it, that is making it this age of wonder? Well, let's turn to Grover Cleveland in his address in 1893. Every American citizen must contemplate with the utmost pride and enthusiasm the growth and expansion of our country, the wonderful thrift and enterprise of our people, and the demonstrated superiority of our free government. So he's saying free enterprise and free government, they're going hand in hand, and everything is awesome. Of course, he gives that address in March of 1893, and about 6 weeks later, the entire economy explodes in the Great Depression of the 19th century. So there's a lot of that going on here. So what are people excited about? Well, and what is he referring to? Well, I won't bury you in statistics, but I can show you here in these two tables, just the column on the right-hand side there, the percent increase, increase in output is just staggering in the last, third of the 19th century. Just look at, for example, steel down towards the bottom, almost an 8,000% increase in output of steel. And steel is the emblematic thing, in the way the silicon chip is the thing that has changed the world in which we live, that makes your grandchildren and perhaps your own children roll their eyes, and you say, when I was a kid, there was only 3 channels and the phone was bolted to the wall. Well, the silicon chip changes everything in our world, and it's steel that changes everything in the late 19th century. So huge output. So it is an age of gold, in terms of the aggregate economy. And there are also some spectacular breakthrough events that are hailed in the same way. This event in particular, expanding the U.S. Continent with the Transcontinental Railroad. This is they know this is a monumental event, and it's in some ways the equivalent of walking on the moon in the 19th century. And this is how people reacted. This was an event that was followed by millions of Americans, and they filled squares, especially where newspapers were published. So, printing house squares all across the country. And there was a telegraph wire attached to the golden spike. So when it was driven to join the last 2 rails, the signal went out that the continent had been spanned. And they knew it. You can see the photograph they took, right? They said, we are literally making epic history here. Let's capture this in a photograph. 1876 was the centennial. So it's a great national celebration, a World's Fair in the city of Philadelphia. And whenever, this is an age of World's Fairs, particularly in the United States, and always front and center of these World's Fairs are technology and industrialization, sort of showcasing the ingenious and incredible, the ingenious mind of the American and the incredible output of our industrial might, which is growing by leaps and bounds. The US economy is, it's hard to even imagine, hard to know where to rank it, say in 1850, but by 1900, it's the #1 industrial economy in the world. So we're soaring into prominence in that regard. Now, the Brooklyn Bridge, 1883, is opened. When we see the Brooklyn Bridge, because it's got those beautiful stone Gothic arch towers, it has a real old 19th century feel to it, even though it's very functional, very important part of New York, has kind of a quaint appearance to it. But in 1883, when it opened, people saw it as the super collider, the space shuttle, name some amazing piece of technology. This was the Brooklyn Bridge. It was seen as just this wonder. And by the way, what makes the Brooklyn Bridge possible? Steel. So it's the steel itself is quite boring, but what steel can do is astonishing. For all of human history, people equated strength with mass, like, big pyramids, big dams, and so forth, mountains. And here, this spindly little harp, as somebody called it, is the strongest structure on the face of the earth. And so it's hailed as a great national event. Again, right up there with walking on the moon. And then the World's Fair of 1893 is worthy of mention because it's centered around this idea of the White City and the future of America being both kind of tied to a classical glory, but also, we're going to solve all of our problems. Cities will be shimmering in white, and our republic will be a model to the world. There are other things that happen in this period. Electricity becomes a mainstream thing, and just stop and think for a moment how we take it for granted. But what was it like to live in the 1880s when suddenly cities, towns, homes began, started to be illuminated, and to be usable at hours, after dark? It's really just an amazing development that at the time was the equivalent of, the rolling out of the internet. If you remember those days back in the 1990s. It's also the age of the skyscraper, so our cities are going to grow larger. And also, something, again, we'd kind of take for granted or we'd see as quaint, which is the phonograph. But the phonograph is a monumental technological achievement and changes, the face of entertainment, changes the face of popular culture, and so on. And the same with the telephone. Even though these devices look really so primitive, they were really hard to imagine until they came online, and they really were celebrated as these amazing breakthroughs in technology. So you got cool stuff, big events, and you've got rock stars like these, self-designed or self-titled captains of industry. John D. Rockefeller, the king of oil. You have Andrew Carnegie, who is the king of steel, and we'll talk about Carnegie in a little bit. But Carnegie has he's the full package, if you will, because he's the true rags to riches guy. All the industrialists, try to tell us that just as they do now in modern times, Elon Musk talks about his impoverished upbringing when he was worth many millions when he was born. Carnegie truly comes as a penniless immigrant with his family in the 1830s, and works his way up to becoming one of the great industrialists of the day. And his thing was steel. Vanderbilt, becomes one of the kings of the railroads, which was, railroads are the largest and most powerful corporations in the world, American railroads. And they, in fact, are the things that invent corporations and invent most of the rules regarding corporations and how they operate and how they fund themselves and how they're organized and so on. So all of this is being invented in this era by these folks. J.P. Morgan is Mr. Wall Street, the face of finance capitalism. And Jay Gould, and I realize as I'm saying all these names that many of these names are relevant to your region, which is the upper Hudson, where a lot of these folks ended up building their mansions, which we'll talk about in a moment. But Jay Gould was into kind of a Wall Street wheeler dealer, owner and merger and breaker of railroads and so on. And to give you an idea of the fame that these people had, again, not everybody loves them, but they are considered great Americans. This is the era in which baseball cards are invented, and so they're part of a advertising scheme by tobacco companies, and so we remember the original baseball cards, Honus Wagner and King Kelly here, but they also did cards for other themes. It's just the baseball ones that were the ones that caught on, but they did ones on presidents, they did ones on wars, and they also did one on the great industrialists of the day. This is from a series called Histories of Poor Boys Who Became Rich and Other Famous People. So Jay Gould was, hailed in just like with a baseball player. It's showing you images of his prowess. I don't think it has stats on the back like a regular baseball card would, that in his case would show, mergers and acquisitions and hostile takeovers and all of that stuff. But to give you an idea of the kind of popular cultural fame that these people enjoyed, at least in some people's minds, they get their own card series. All right, so I think it's pretty clear. It's an age of optimism and of innovation and just a lot of dazzle. But below the surface, and sometimes above the surface, there's a lot going on that is really making it also an age of anxiety, that duality. For one, there's inescapable evidence that there's more poverty in the United States than there has been in the past. Now, when I show this, when I give this talk before a live audience, I always say to the audience, what literature does this image bring to mind? And literally audibly, everybody just says it out loud. They say Dickens, and that's the right answer. It's not Dickens, but the artist drew this to evoke Dickens. So this is this is called the Hearthstone of the Poor, and it's on the front cover of Harper's Weekly, the #1 magazine in America. So it's not some hidden, it's really trying to get people's attention. And so this is a good point good opportunity here to point out a really important thing, which is, you know, many of you are old enough to remember the Cold War and the 20th century, and the idea that America knew what it was. We believed we were a capitalist democracy that believed in human rights and so forth, and that our opposite was communism, and the Soviet Union in particular. We were not you know, we knew we were American and we were not communists. In the 19th century, the opposite was Europe. So we said we are Americans. We believe in democracy and individualism and freedom and opportunity and all that stuff, and we are not European. Now, this is not ethnic. This is political. And what they're saying is we broke away from that world of kings and queens and you know, landed estates and fixed classes and established churches, and we broke and you know, aristocracy. We broke away from that to create this republic. And from that moment on, Americans have always been anxious through the 19th century about, are we backsliding? Are we sliding back towards a Europeanization? And so this is a vivid image of Europe, of dreaded Europeanization, that you have in an American city, a family huddled over a steam grate while a wealthy family saunters on by, and only the children of the wealthy notice that family. So, and again, this is in a major publication in the US. We also have other scenes. This is a scene also from Harper's, showing people on the west side of Manhattan scrounging through it's a barge, and it's being loaded, you know, filled with garbage. You can see the couple of wagons are dumping the refuse, and the poor are scampering over this, looking for food, looking for shoes, looking for things they can fix, scrap they can sell. And this is a scene that, you know, in modern times we associate with developing countries that have incredible poverty problems, and there are huge, massive dumps that people live in and do the very same thing. So it's a very un-American, at least in the American's mind, in the late 19th century, very un-American scene. Walt Whitman, who was still alive in 1879 and still not writing as much, but giving speeches, kind of summed it up in this amazing paragraph, this anxiety, and also the anxiety of sliding back into a European style of government. If the United States, like the countries of the old world, so Europe, are also to grow vast crops of poor, desperate, dissatisfied, nomadic, miserably waged populations, such as we see looming upon us of late years, more and more poor people, then our Republican experiment, notwithstanding all of its surface successes, the Guild, is at heart an unhealthy failure. So he says, if we're becoming more and more like, you know, Manchester, England, our republic is disintegrating. Our Republican experiment is a failure if this is the trend that we're going in. This is also the period in which disturbing ideologies, at least to some people, are developed. Social Darwinism. Many people said there's no problem. The poor are the poor because they're just losers, and they have weak constitutions. They don't possess the self-discipline, and you can see this, you know, kind of summed up in this pretty harsh quotation. What a blessing to let the unreformed drunkard and his children die and not increase them above all others, meaning have more children. How wise to let those of weak digestion from gluttony die and the temperate live. What a benevolence to let the lawless perish and the prudent survive. What hardcore publication did this come from? Well, it came from the Christian Advocate, the nation's number one religious publication. So it was a mainstream set of ideas, this kind of hard individualist, really a warping of Darwinism. It's really important to point out that this is not Darwin. This is somebody taking Darwin's ideas and applying it to society. All right, a second category of concern, rising concern over big business. Big business is new in this era. So it's unnerving to Americans as they see what big business is and what it's capable of, particularly big business as a threat to democracy. And so I often joke when I show this slide, I say, hey, you know, you're going to be shocked by this, but there was a time in America where corporations had undue influence in Washington with their money and with their lobbyists and so forth. And, you know, thank goodness we got rid of that. Ha ha. We can talk about that at the end of our talk and also during the Q&A. But here you see an image of, you know, the cartoon is the bosses of the Senate from Puck magazine. Again, this is important to point out. This is not a labor union publication. This is not America's socialist press. This is the mainstream capitalist press expressing this anxiety. So it's not just, you know, Carnegie's workers who are anxious about the fate of the country. Wealthy people, well-established people are concerned. And so you see the senators are these little itty-bitty figures compared to the monopolists who are literally money bags, and they're labeled the trusts of Steel Trust, Cotton Trust, and so on. doorway says entrance for monopolists. The doorway towards the rear of towards the, the background of the image, I don't know if you can read it, but it says people's entrance, and there's a sign over it that says closed. The people are being shut out of the people's representative chamber. And the sign in the middle says this is the Senate of the monopolies, by the monopolies, for the monopolies. So very clear expression of anxiety. Here's another one, and this one is more specific. It actually mentions that this is John D. Rockefeller, and you can see in the background the Capitol has been turned into an oil refinery, and Rockefeller, with his jeweler's magnifying glass, is looking at. He's picked up the White House, and the caption says it all. What a strange little government, by which it means Rockefeller is going about his business, becoming the great oil tycoon, getting involved in all of the realms of business. He's the richest man on the face of the earth. And day in and day out, minute to minute, he never thinks about the government. He is above the government. He's beyond the reach of democracy. He's the most powerful man in America, and he can't, be thrown out of office. He can't, be done in by term limits or anything. So it's a real sense that this is something the founding fathers could never have envisioned. People this powerful, right? In the late 18th century, everybody agreed that power was corrupting and power was dangerous. And the only place there was power was in government, right? So we created government to be small, to be decentralized, to have checks and balances. 100 years later, everybody still agrees that power is the great threat to liberty, but now power resides in the hands of individuals and in the businesses that they run. So what to do? We'll get to that in a moment. I could show you lots. This is the Gilded Age. One of its great things is these astonishing political cartoons, and we could spend hours on them. But I love this one in particular. And again, this is in a mainstream, pro-business publication. But it shows a lineup of capitalists on the left. You can see them in the front row, and they're all identifiable. There's Cyrus Field, Jay Gould, Rockefeller, and they are cheering on this magnificent, representation of monopoly. It's a knight. So again, that's evoking Europe and European, knighthood and power and aristocracy. The knight is clad in gold, and it's riding on the thing of the day, which is the locomotive. And if you look really closely, everything's got a label. So the device that he's on is labeled monopoly. And then the scrawny worker is on this bedraggled, starving horse. And the only weapon this worker has is the strike. That mallet in his hand is labeled strike, saying, I don't want to use it, but it's the only pushback way I can, exert some pushback against this incredibly uneven fight. And if you look in the background, that doesn't look like a healthy country, right? Those are really bedraggled, skinny people. They don't look like healthy Americans. So this is an indictment of where we're heading. Oh, and here's another one. J.P. Morgan rowing the boat with Uncle Sam, beside him, and it's a riff on this painting that you see in the lower right, which is a very popular painting, kind of a Norman Rockwell before Norman Rockwell kind of painting with a grandpa fisherman with his granddaughter, and giving her the impression that she's helping him row the boat. So there's a lot of concern about big business, and also about the big businesses, their attitude. John D. Rockefeller infamously said, "The public be damned," when he was asked about, the public's concern for the way he ran his business. Vanderbilt said, when somebody asked, "Isn't that illegal? What you're doing with, your companies and so forth?" And he said, "What do I care about the law? Haven't I got the power?" And then Jay Gould said at one point, when asked about labor unions growing stronger and the Knights of Labor, making inroads into his labor force, he said, I don't care. I could pay one half the working class to kill the other half. Even if these are fake quotes, which some people, dispute whether or not how accurate they are, everybody believed them. And you can see these quotes all, in political cartoons and in commentaries. These are things that these guys are saddled with because they are seen as sort of the height of arrogance. Also note in these images, two of the three people here are dressed as kings, right? Not by accident. It's a pejorative. They're saying these people are acting un-American. They are acting in a way that threatens democracy. Democracy is the opposite of monarchy. All right, another category of concern, rising inequality. And again, people are not imagining this problem. It's very, very real. So in 1890, the 1%, by the way, guess what era in American history this phrase, the 1%, originates? It's this period. The 1% owned 51% of all US wealth. And the lower 44%, basically the lower half of Americans, owned only 1.2%. So incredible disparity in terms of overall wealth. Another way to look at it, the top 1%, which is 125,000 families had an average of $264,000 in property. The lower 44%, most Americans had only $125 in property average. So these are alarming stats. And we can break them down in all kinds of different ways, but basically it's all pointing to incredible economic inequality. Now we should stop here and say very few people, except for maybe a small subset of socialists, are calling for equality. What they're calling for is a manageable, a reasonable amount of inequality. And that's really what it comes down to, that it's extreme inequality that is threatening the republic. And it's also not that just people are super wealthy and that they're using this power to influence politics and to buy state legislatures and congressmen. It's also the way they're behaving is alarming to the average American. It's captivating. So this is where we get the society pages and the birth of, if you can draw a straight line from this photo to the Kardashians, put it that way, this, celebrity and celebrity culture with wealthy people. So the robber barons, or the wealthy of this era, begin to act in ways that are decidedly un-American and un-Republican. Just to give you an example, in the 1830s, the wealthy mansions, the wealthy homes in New York around Gramercy Park, which is the wealthiest neighborhood in the city, are very modest. They're still there. Very modest, brick-faced buildings. They're beautiful inside, but they're not castles. They're not mansions. And and people could have built mansions in that era. They are stayed. They are understated, and that's because it was un-Republican to be flashy, to be gaudy, to live like a European aristocrat, which is just unseemly. And so, but 50 years later, that's all gone. The new, particularly new money Americans say, we've got it, we're going to flaunt it, and we're going to act just like the rich do in Europe. And so the kind of signature event is the Vanderbilt Ball of 1883. Mrs. Vanderbilt wants to have a housewarming party for her castle. There's no other way to describe it. I'll show you a photo in a moment, on Fifth Avenue, where all the other castles are being built by the wealthy. And she invites, the top 400 people in the city, all the wealthy families, and says it's a costume party. And people come in all kinds of different costumes, but the number one category of costume is European royalty. And so you see Marie Antoinette, this is Halliburton Bridgham as Marie Antoinette, and they're Louis XIV and many, many others doing what was just unthinkable 30, 40, 50 years ago. This touched off a kind of a competition of huge, expensive, opulent parties and balls. And I always showed this one because it's just the strangest one of all. This is one from 1908, and it's a horseback dinner. So one of the wealthy kingpins in New York goes to the most expensive restaurant, Sherry's, in New York City, and says to the manager, "Don't say no, just tell me how much. I want to take over your ballroom. I want to, your main dining room, excuse me, empty it out. I want to put down real sod, a couple tons of dirt with grass on top of it. I want to put up forestry, outdoor tapestries to give it an outdoor look. And then I want 40 horses to be brought into the dining room and to be fitted with special tables that fit on top of their saddles. And then I want your entire staff to be dressed like stable boys. And we're gonna have me, myself, and 39 of my best friends will have a horseback dinner in your ballroom. Who knows how many millions of dollars in today's money that cost, to give you a sense of that excess and a kind of competition among the super rich. Here's the Vanderbilt Mansion. You can see why I'm referring to it as a castle. If I had shown you the color photo on the right by itself and said, "Where am I?" or "Where is this?" I bet half of you would say Versailles, right? A palace, a literal palace in France. But it's the interior of this building on Fifth Avenue. We also know that the wealthy, you got like a day like today, of course, you got to get to the shore. So you need to build yourself a 64 room mansion in Newport, Rhode Island. Or upstate New York, where you folks are, is another zone where a lot of opulent castles were built by some of the wealthiest people in America to get out of the city, to get away from in that era, it wasn't just the heat, it was cholera, it was diphtheria, it was all the epidemics that would explode during the summer months. You can also imagine, I'll just hold that thought for a moment, just think about the 19th century city and think about if you could time travel back to 1883, the thing that would astonish you the most, more than the accents that people had, more than technology and all that, is the smell. the 19th century city was, just full of horses and full of people and not a lot of good sewage, sewer lines and sewer treatment. So getting out of the city was a priority, but it was only available to the wealthy. I'm jumping ahead here a little bit by, raising that question: are we in another Gilded Age? Because as I was looking up those mansions, it turns out there are other mansions being constructed in your region in the same spirit of that era. And this is a building, a house that I saw, Greystone on Hudson, completed in 2017 for $13 million. I don't know if that price is held, but so we are back in an era of, you take a look at the house that Bill Gates, I was going to say with he and his wife, but I guess he now lives in, it's 24,000 square feet or some, maybe even more. Another phenomenon, again, emphasizing this Europeanization. Who knows what a dollar princess is? Well, a dollar princess is, so this is the great, it's a perfect match. European royalty and European aristocracy have titles, history, connections, and they're all broke. They're all going under. The story of Downton Abbey, they're all going under because it's a changing world, and having tenants and all that stuff just doesn't make any sense. And Americans have boatloads of cash, but no history, no titles, no connections. And so Americans begin to marry off their daughters to the sons of European aristocrats, to the tune of several hundred. You look at this list here. I don't know what a viscountess is, but anyway, it's or a marchioness, but you get the idea that Americans are matching up with Europeans to literally become actual aristocrats. And this woman in this image, she's the most famous of them all. You may know her. She's a New Yorker. She's named Jenny Jerome from New York. Her father was a nouveau riche, Gilded Age zillionaire. And the Churchills had titles, they had land, they had history, and they were broke. And so they, after a 6-month negotiation, kind of like signing a top pitcher for the New York Yankees, they arranged the marriage, and the two got married in 1874. So the Churchill line, this is Winston Churchill's parents. Always good to remember he's half American. They were a product of this process. Oh yeah, I mentioned Downton Abbey. I guess I got ahead of myself. But Cora is the daughter of a steel magnate who has cash, and the Crawfords don't have. They've got everything but cash, and so it's a perfect match. Even Titanic. It's a wonderfully entertaining movie, but they do get a lot of the history, the sort of broader era right. And if you remember the love interest there of Rose, Cal, he is an arrogant, swaggering American, but he's a steel magnate from Pittsburgh. And when he gives her that rare diamond, she is kind of stunned by it. And he says, Rose, she says, I feel like royalty. And he says, Rose, we are the new royalty. So it isn't just an imagined process, it's actual. And again, this is fiction, but it's sort of capturing that spirit of, we actually aspire to be aristocrats. We're not afraid to embrace that anymore. One of the people who bucked this trend it's interesting to point this out, that Andrew Carnegie was smart enough to know that this is not good. This is a bad look. And so he conducted himself in a way that tried to sort of offset the behavior of Jay Gould and Vanderbilt and Morgan. And this was, he was a popular writer. He gave a lot of speeches, all of them sort of explaining that, basically saying everything's fine, right? The economy is fine. Sure, there's some trouble here and there's some poverty, but everything basically is fine. And you don't need to worry about my wealth because I'm gonna become a great philanthropist. So the great contrast here is J.P. Morgan in this photo is trying to kill a photographer for daring to take his photo. And Carnegie loves the camera. There are hundreds and hundreds of photos of Andrew Carnegie. He knew that this image, he looks like, your grandfather, wouldn't harm a flea. He's a benevolent guy. And usually I stop at this point and say, who does he remind you? And if I say this to my students, they all shout out, Santa Claus, right? And that's because if he's not trying to look like Santa Claus, he's trying to look like the broadly speaking, the figure that Santa Claus represents, right? A gentle grandfatherly figure who brings goodies and is, kind and wise and not threatening. Carnegie, so he had that image. He also had that popular image of writing and speaking. And he also very ostentatiously gave away a lot of his fortune, building institutions like Carnegie Hall, but also more than 1,000 public libraries across the United States and another 1,000 in other parts of the world. So he kind of made an effort to kind of offset that negative image. And he got lots of kudos for it. You can see, praising cartoon here is he's giving out money in libraries. Another one where he's literally building a wall of libraries, or a temple. So he's quite famous. But Carnegie in 1892 is at the center of one of the great clashes in the Gilded Age, which is the Homestead Strike of 1892. He leaves the country like a coward, leaves the business in the hands of his right-hand man, Henry Clay Frick, and says to Frick, smash the union, if the strike comes along, smash the strike. And he locks out the workers, and they tries to bring in armed Pinkertons, who are basically anti-union, or a private strike-breaking force. They call themselves detectives. They're not detectives. And there's an epic clash outside the factory. About 6 strikers and 6 Pinkertons are killed, and it makes national headlines because it's the most famous capitalist is embroiled, even though he's fled the country. And this is a strike that really grabs the nation's attention. It exposes Carnegie for his on the one hand, on the right-hand side, being this benevolent Santa Claus, giving out libraries and cash to public causes, and then on the left-hand side, announcing a wage cut to his workers. So saying his fortune is based on exploitation. At least that's the message of this cartoon. There's also accompanying, as Homestead Strike indicates, tremendous anxiety over labor capital conflict. Because in America, we tell ourselves, in the 19th century, we still tell ourselves that there are no classes. Classes are a European thing. We have people of different income levels, but there's nothing holding people in place, and therefore we don't have class conflict. And then the Gilded Age says otherwise. Now, this is not conflict, but this is a good indication of what's happening. Labor Day is invented in the summer of 1882. And just stop and think, why do you need a Labor Day? Well, it's not a day to go to the beach. It's not a day to end summer. It's a day to say, America, your society is going over a cliff. Workers, the heart and soul of America, are being ground down. Their wages are plummeting. Their hours are going up. They get no respect in the workplace. And so they invent this holiday to call attention to the crisis of American labor, which they say is the crisis of the Republic. It's not just that one portion of the country is not doing well. It's the foundation of the country. And Labor Day begins in that manner. I'll give you a couple of stats. Between 1881 and 1900, so just the last 20 years of the 19th century, 37,000 strikes. There are probably not 3,000 strikes in all of American history leading up to 1881, and then there's 37,000 in the next 20 years. And some of them are, they're huge. Some of them are small, but some of them are positively gigantic, including these 3, the 1877 railroad strike, which paralyzed the nation's railroad system, Homestead Strike, which we just talked about, and then the Pullman Strike, another national railroad strike. And these strikes are often long, they're expensive, and they're often quite violent. Between the 1870s and 1914, people are still doing research into this, but a minimum of 500 American workers were killed in strikes, possibly as many as 800. And look at the comparison. Great Britain is roaring into the industrial age just as fast as we are. In fact, they're ahead of us. Germany, France, these are all industrializing countries experiencing many of the same problems and questions, yet the death toll is just a fraction. It's an interesting point of comparison. This is also, this is the Great Uprising of 1877. That uprising, which was violent and led to the death of 100 workers, led to the building of armories in large cities. And the armories are there to have troops on hand in case there's civil unrest, and also a place where the wealthy can take refuge. They can go inside and hide while the army goes out there and guns down the insurrection. Yep, this is the 7th Regiment Armory in New York City. All right, rising concern over immigration. And I'm only hitting on the big ones. There are lots and lots of themes here they're churning this anxiety. Immigration was big before 1870, but it positively explodes starting in the 1870s. Mass migration on an unprecedented scale in global history. And it's being there's a lot of push factors in Europe, war and poverty and et cetera, and persecution, but also technology. More and more people learning about America because of more mass production of information, telegraphs, letters, and also steamships. In this era, you can get to America in like 8 days, 9 days, and for a very modest fee. And the doors are wide open. There's almost no immigration restriction. Even the laws that are on the books are barely ever enforced. But this is not surprising. In this, we live in an age of anxiety, and what do we see in the 21st century in America? Surging anti-immigrant sentiment. People are blaming part of the problems in America on immigration, and this is exactly the case in the late 19th century. Uncle Sam holding his nose at the entrance to America as this inferior European peasant, carrying bag labeled disease, poverty, superstition, and many other negative qualities is, and the point is, he's going to be allowed in. Uncle Sam's holding his nose, but there's no way to stop him. So this is a condemnation of Congress. Some groups had the vitriol aimed at them most intensely, especially the Chinese, and this leads to the Chinese Exclusion Act. So we do in fact pass an exclusion law, our first ever, aimed at one immigrant group, and that's the Chinese, starting in 1882. Here's another one. This is called the Fool Pied Piper. And again, this is a condemnation of Congress. This is saying our laws are inadequate to the problems of the day. So you see the Uncle Sam yet again, and he's not the Pied Piper, because the Pied Piper saves society by leading, playing his pipe and getting the rats to drown themselves in the ocean. This Pied Piper is leading the rats of Europe to America. You can see the Statue of Liberty in the distance, and the flute that he's playing is labeled lax immigration laws. Notice the reaction of the European leaders. They're psyched, right? We're taking their wretched refuse from their teeming shores. And if you look really closely, the rats are designed to look like certain people, like Jewish immigrants, Italian immigrants. There's one carrying a torch. That's an anarchist symbol. There's some that are just labeled thief and brigand, socialist, and so forth. So it's a real visceral anti-immigrant sentiment in this period. Here's I won't show you too many, as much as I would love to, because I love my Gilded Age cartoons, but Lady Liberty holding attack dogs labeled law and order, familiar phrase from today's political discourse, to stop immigrants climbing over a wall, another image of our political discourse today. And these are, they're just a savage, dangerous looking group of people carrying bombs and knives and looking very unhealthy and a threat to the nation. And yet another one, why not? This is by the same artist as the Fool Pied Piper. You can see, and it's again showing riffraff immigration, and Uncle Sam is standing by the sign saying a threat to American ideas and institutions. This is aimed specifically at ideology. So some people would look at those 37,000 strikes and say, that's not because our system is exploitive and misguided and that we're harming our workers and so forth. It's because we're letting all these nutty Europeans in with who are spreading socialism and communism and anarchism, and they're infecting, they use that kind of medical metaphor, they're infecting otherwise sober, hardworking, disciplined American workers, and that's why we have all these strikes. So you don't want strikes, you keep the socialists out. That's basically what they're calling for here. And I'll just pop through a couple of these, but this is where our earliest immigration, discrimination laws come from, restriction laws, Chinese Exclusion Act, contract labor, which means you can't go to Europe and hire 20 people and bring them to America to work. That was one of those trick questions at Ellis Island. Do you have a job here in America waiting for you? And if you said yes, you could be deported, sent back, because, and you would think as an immigrant, you want to prove that you're ready to work, but it was a question to, screen out contract laborers. Federal Immigration Act of 1890, that's when the federal government takes over immigration. Before that, it was left to the states, and that's the law that leads to Ellis Island. And the first sort of broad categories of exclusion, which were poor health, poverty, criminality, or radicalism, looking for, I don't know how many people answered, when someone said, are you an anarchist? They said yes. I guess if you're pretty zealous, you might answer yes. But that was a ticket out of the country. And again, you can see the imagery there in the cartoon, dumping European garbage. We are getting the worst of the worst, according to those cartoonists. Yep, Ellis Island was not built as a museum for you to go and get misty-eyed about your grandparents and your great-grandparents. It is that now, of course. It's a wonderful museum, but it was built to exclude Americans, to exclude a certain category of European immigrants. There are also intellectual responses to this. So we saw one actual response, which was sort of the institutional response, labor unions forming the Knights of Labor, staging strikes, inventing Labor Day. Those are important responses, but there's also, intellectuals, including this guy who I've spent many decades working on a book on Henry George, which finally came out back in 2015. And Henry George is one of the great figures of this period. He's a fascinating figure. only has a 6th grade education, but writes the best-selling economics book on economics in the 19th century, and it's still in print in like 25 languages. It's called Progress and Poverty. And think about that title. It's the perfect title. And believe me, he had some really bad title ideas before he came on that one. What is the Gilded Age? It's the age of progress and all that we talked about. And it's also, maddeningly, the age of poverty. And George says, why is it that we have so much, why does poverty not decrease with progress? That's would seem intuitive, but it's not happening. Something's wrong. And he's got a great metaphor, writer or imaginer of metaphors, the wedge, right? It is though an immense wedge were being forced not underneath society, which would lift, lots of people, but through society, meaning that those above the wedge, the chisel, are going to be raised, but those below are going to be crushed down by that process. And then in a nutshell, George says, this association of poverty with progress is the great enigma of our times. It is the riddle which the Sphinx of fate puts to our civilization, in which not to answer is to be destroyed. So George and many people are not messing around. They're saying it's not just that America's in trouble or these are problems. They're saying we are careening over a cliff. And when we go over that cliff, there's no going back. So we have got to act. Everybody, or I shouldn't say everybody, lots of people agree we have to act. The question is how and in what manner. Socialists and some people want to tinker with the economy as opposed to radically change it. Edward Bellamy is another best-selling author who writes the book Looking Backward, published in 1887. And it's basically a tale of a Rip Van Winkle story, right? A guy falls asleep and he wakes up 100 years later in 1987 in Boston, and America has solved all of its problems and it is a socialist utopia. Everybody's happy, everybody's employed, everybody has what they want. People only work 10 hours a week. There's public parks, there's public school, everything is fantastic. And so it's a socialist utopian tale disguised. He doesn't call it socialism, he calls it nationalism because he wants to sell books and get his ideas across. Bellamy, like George, becomes incredibly popular, and Henry George clubs open all across, formed all across the country. Bellamy clubs are also formed and spread all across the country. These are just two examples. So we're getting close to the end here. What is the end of the rest of the story? Well, the rest of the story, I was joking before the talk, that the rest of the story is the next lecture I give to you guys. And it's the progressive era. The progressive era, again, doesn't have a firm beginning point. It used to be 1900, but now historians sort of see that Gilded Age and progressive era as sort of overlapping quite substantially. But Teddy Roosevelt, pictured here, is sort of the symbol of it, right? He comes into office in 1901, and he's not the most progressive person. He's not the only progressive. He doesn't invent progressivism, but he has the power of the bully pulpit and the power of the presidency and the power to influence politics. And basically the progressive era, if you were to boil it down, or the Gilded Age is when all these problems pop to the surface. And the progressive era is the era in which city, state, and federal government agencies and individuals begin to work hard to, if not solve these problems, to mitigate them, to lessen those problems. So, this is everything from establishing departments of public health, right, to clean up the American cities so many people don't die of diseases, but also laws that will regulate corporations and trusts and the railroads and everything in between. So it's a fascinating era, but it's one where, it circles back to that question I raised, at one point, saying, when a guy like Rockefeller emerges and his cohort of industrialists, people say the founders could never have imagined this sort of undemocratic source of power. And that's, if you were to sort of boil down or, summarize progressivism, it's when we make that pivot. In the 18th century, we said, power is a threat to liberty and power is in government. So we need to make government weak. As weak as possible and still have it functional. 100 years later, people are saying the same thing. They're saying power is still the threat to liberty, but that power now resides in private hands, private corporations. And so now we need to strengthen the government up to a point to become the referee, to become the thing that will diminish the power or regulate the power of corporations in the name of the common good. And so it's an interesting shift. Anytime you hear somebody say, well, the founding fathers didn't, we could go on and on about that. But so this is an evolution of our political culture, and it's a real important transition moment. So the question I started with, and the question which we'll end with, was, what was the Gilded Age? I think we have a pretty good idea of what it was. And are we in another one now? I will not answer the other one, the second one, but I'll just give you some things to think about. There are many people that believe we are in a second Gilded Age. And if you were to go to Amazon, one of the symbols of monopoly and power and et cetera, the Jeff Bezos is the Vanderbilt of our era in some ways. If you were to look up, just put in the title, Second Gilded Age or New Gilded Age into their book search, you'll come up with dozens of books that have come out in the last 10, 15 years with those phrases in it: New Gilded Age, Second Gilded Age, as a reflection of where we are now. So, and the resurgence of that statistic, or that claim, the call, the 1%, and and you see the guy with the sign, we are the 99%, or the stunning images of late showing thousands of cars lined up to go to food banks during the pandemic. I mean, that's a pandemic induced problem, but it also shows how vulnerable people were at that moment. So what are the parallels? Well, we can agree that we are in an age of surging anti-immigration anger. Anti-labor sentiment is pretty high. Voter disenfranchisement efforts at an all-time high for the last, I mean, it remains an open question how they'll compare to the voter restriction efforts of the late 19th century, but they are certainly trending in that direction. Tremendous concern over corporate power, and this is borne out in polling data and so forth. Concern about money in politics, also something that people are talking about, and it's a top priority or top concern of people in polling data. Political polarization and paralysis, that was the defining feature of American politics during the Gilded Age, particularly in Congress. Religion versus secularism, this is not a recent phenomenon. The challenges and pushing for women's rights and push back against women's rights, very much evident in our modern time. The great battle, as always in American history, the battle between individualism and the common good. They're not opposites, but they are in tension with each other. And that seems to be, what did we see during the pandemic? We saw people saying, for the common good, we all need to do everything we can to keep each other safe. I'll wear a mask, you wear a mask, we'll change our behavior, etc. And then you saw a lot of our other Americans saying, no way. The only rights that exist are my rights. My right to not wear a mask supersedes everything else. And that's just a modern, version, a modern example of this tension that we've had for a long, long time. And of course, concerns about income and wealth inequality, very evident in the late 19th century, very evident today, in both cases backed up by a lot of data. And speaking of data, when did our modern day Gilded Age begin, if we call it that, or at least suggest that it might be one? It starts roughly in 1980. That's when we change our tax codes. Remember I said history is a study of choices? These things simply don't happen. My students are familiar with one of the things I say all the time to them is nothing just is. Nothing just happens, right? Everything is triggered by actions, by people doing things. And we radically changed our corporate regulations in the 1980s. We radically changed our tax structure and tax policies in the 1980s. And you can draw a straight line to the rising percentage, the top 1%, sees their wealth rise into the 30s. I believe in 2020, the top 1% wealth has crossed over into 40%. So they're reclaiming that, if it keeps going, it'll be back to 1890 when the 1% controlled 51% of American wealth. All right. So one of the great figures of the Gilded Age is Mark Twain, and he said, or at least he's alleged to have said, again, if he didn't say it, that's okay, because it's a great phrase anyway, and it's a very Twainian phrase. The past does not repeat itself, but it rhymes. And so we would never say that this is a replica of the Gilded Age, but it's pretty clear. There's about 15 things that are similar to it, and there are very similar questions, just in different form that we're wrestling with. And I will end with my favorite quotation. I think if I had to choose only one history quote, it would be this one by James Baldwin. History does not refer merely or even principally to the past. I mean, that's a pretty bold statement. History is not really about the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. So history's present at Black Lives Matter protests. History's present in where you live and why you are there. History's present in what jobs you have. All innumerable aspects of our life. There's a history behind that, and it's important that we realize that. Okay, I am going to leave it there, and I think we are right on time. And I'm going to try to hang on. I'm going to unshare my screen and look forward to your questions. Have I unshared the screen?
You have. You
Okay,
have.
good.
It's all good.
Great.
Professor O'Donnell, that was fabulous. Thank you
All right.
so much. We
Thank you.
we have some questions, and I think your talk just calls out questions. So, obviously, something that you described was the growing role of labor and labor unions
Mhm.
at this time. And this may be something that may be a little bit outside your expertise, but what role do you think labor unions will play in addressing the current economic inequality in our country today?
Well, there's a lot of ways to answer that question, but one is that broadly speaking, um, the countries that are like us, like Germany, France, and so on, that have a robust, the G7 countries that have strong labor unions have challenges about inequality, but nothing close to what we have. So there's a correlation between strong labor unions and broad prosperity. Another way to put that is, what's the greatest period of American prosperity? The time where we were least unequal. So inequality was at its lowest point. It's from the 40s to the 70s. That 1940 to 1980 time period, and that's the period in American history where unions were phenomenally powerful and strong. By the mid 50s, a third of all American workers are in unions. And what's one of the things that happens in the 1980s, symbolized by President Reagan's firing of all the PATCO, the air traffic controllers, is a steady anti-labor. It always drives me nuts when I hear on NPR or somewhere they say there's been a decline in labor unions over the last few decades. It's like, no, there's not been a decline. There's been a systematic dismantling of labor unions by over the last 40 years. It isn't just that they've withered on the vine. The laws have been passed, and conditions have changed so that the government and business have kind of teamed up against labor unions. So there's a lot of people who look to the resurgence of labor unions as a way to course correct as a society.
So next question is, who was the conscience of the Gilded Age time? Was it writers, reporters, social leaders? Who were the people that were speaking out about all the things you were talking about?
Well, I mean, I think there's a guy like Henry George is certainly one of them. He's a person that is deeply concerned about what the troubles that he sees, and that's why he, in his own free time, writes this 500-page economics book that sort of diagnoses the problems of the era. His solution is kind of a bit of a strange one. It's a single tax on get rid of all taxes and just tax one single tax on land and resources. People didn't necessarily go for that. I mean, some people did, and people are still advocating something like a single tax these days. But it's his critique of, his diagnosis, not necessarily his prescription. But you've got many other figures, in the same. These are all overlapping movements. So the populist movement is exploding in this era, and so Mary Lease was one of the great women leaders of the era of the populist movement, and the kind of voice of the rural version of 37,000 strikes, right? All these farmers who are feeling the pinch from the railroad because you can't get your product to market without getting a loan from a bank, getting transit from the railroads, and getting storage of your product from the storage companies. And so they are up in arms and waging a political campaign. This is also the period of Reconstruction. So you've got a guy like Frederick Douglass, who was the great voice of abolition, but he's also one of the great voices of decrying what's happening when African Americans after the Civil War get complete full equality, civil rights. They begin running for office. The first cohort of them come to Congress. It's an astonishing reinvention of American democracy that is very rapidly completely dismantled in the face of and replaced with white supremacy and Jim Crow, that is only chipped away at and then really overturned in the 1960s. So those are just a couple of figures. It's an era in which there are a lot of people speaking out, and you even have theologians or ministers. This is an era in which something called the social gospel is not necessarily invented, but popularized, where a minister says, look, you can't just go to church on Sunday, punch the ticket, put a little money in the collection plate and say, I'm a good Christian, and then go about your business, and ignoring social problems or being the source of social problems, like the way you treat your workers. Says, read the Gospels. Jesus is talking about poverty, exploitation, power, terrible politicians, et cetera. This is you're not a good Christian unless you're out there battling day in and day out about the inequalities and the injustices of your society. So that's another, voice, another idea that comes out of the Gilded Age.
So interesting, that leads to another question, that is the role of religious leaders. And I'm talking about religious leaders at the time, the upper echelons perhaps of the Protestant or Episcopalian churches that were prevalent across much of America. What was their role? Were they, trying to attack and challenge the inequality and all the things of the Gilded Age, or were they complacent with what was going on?
Yeah, I think that in the same way, like 100 years from now, what will people be saying about our religious leaders, right? You've got, ministers that are preaching the prosperity gospel, and flying in $20 million jets, and living, a lavish lifestyle, and saying that, my prosperity is evidence of my virtue, and if you want to be, you can have this too. Jesus is a capitalist, and yet you also have people that are, religious figures that are working with gangs and working in troubled neighborhoods and doing, the kind of real roll up your sleeves form of Christianity. And that's true in the late 19th century. You've got many ministers that are speaking out against the injustices of society and calling upon Americans to reread the Gospels in light of that social justice message. But you've got others that are just simply saying, no, your job is your personal piety is all that really matters. Your personal relationship with God is all that matters. And you should be a good Christian and put money in the collection plate. You should be a decent employer, but we're not going to challenge the social structure, the political structure, any of that. That's not our place.
So here's an interesting question, which perhaps has a bit of perhaps a loaded assumption in it. It's different now in that the captains of the internet use their power to promote progressivism. Correct?
Well, the great phrase of the day, which I talk about with my students all the time, because a lot of students will self-identify as, I'm socially liberal, fiscally conservative, and I have a lot of fun in trying to, from my perspective, explaining to them how that's really, if you really break that down, it's not a tenable position. It's in its superficiality, it seems to make sense, and so that's what corporate titans, particularly the Silicon Valley types, are just giving. They have great employment policies when it comes to healthcare and same-sex partnerships and giving money to all kinds of causes, but many of those folks are libertarians, and which I could talk about at length, but I will in not very nice terms. But they are they've got billionaire hero complex, and they believe that everything they built is something they themselves built. It is detached from the world in which they originated, and the government that has made laid the groundwork for their success. I mean, there's I can't think of who it was, but a social critic pointed out that my iPhone's across the room, but if you holds up an iPhone, he goes, there are 7 essential pieces of technology in this iPhone. All 7 of them were funded by government research. So, but the people behind that, digital revolution, many of them are, averse to the government having anything to do with them, to regulate their industry, and to, heaven forbid, to tax them, either their company or themselves. So, just Jeff Bezos and these folks have made more money in the last year than they've made in probably any other year, and yet are paying almost no taxes whatsoever. And their companies are paying almost no taxes whatsoever. New York Times published an article about a month ago, maybe 6 weeks ago, about listing all the top companies that made billions in profits and paid zero or negative tax, meaning they got money from the government when they filed their taxes. So anyway, that's that's kind of a long answer, but that's where I see it, that they're trying to thread the needle on that, saying we're good people, but don't interfere with what we do. The private enterprise business, the business of business is business, and the government should stay out. And they'll often conjure up mythical images of like that way back when the government was not involved in the economy, the government didn't interfere, and that's completely false, right? We know there's endless examples of the government being a very active player in the economy, either in boosting the economy or in regulating the economy.
Another question, does the media, such as it is today, serve as more of a counterbalance to big business and rising inequality today than it did in the Gilded Age? And what about social media?
Yeah, I mean, the problem, if you recall that image of the knight that was sort of a hybrid of a locomotive and a knight, and I said everything is in that image, everything's got little labels on it to show you the problems. The lance that he's carrying and pointing at that scrawny worker says, I think it says subsidized press. And what the critic is saying, the artist is saying is, look, the press is universally against us. The press is a capitalist enterprise. The press is business. They rely on business to take out advertising. And so the press was, and I can say this, having read a lot of Gilded Age newspapers, the press is generally hostile to organized labor and to strikes and any of those actions. And so there's never going to be a time when the press is detached from business interests. But we, in this current era, we are, the media is very important, but the media is probably more so business oriented and corporately owned. I mean, if you just look at, a couple, 3-4 years ago, Sinclair, which is a huge media conglomerate, was allowed to purchase, I don't know what, they've got control over almost all local, or 70% of American local news broadcasters. And they happen to be very conservative, so they are dictating editorial policy in these areas where they have control. And more importantly, media is disappearing, so that the number of small local newspapers, local radio stations, local TV stations has been just decimated with the birth of the internet and the other sources of news. So the media plays an important role. But the media itself is part of, in some ways, part of the problem. It reflects the problem, and it's also part of the problem.
So another question is today, comparing the Gilded Age with some of what's going on today. Today, the globe is so much better connected, and if issues going on in our country are often directly impacted by awareness and political, social, and economic events in other places around the world, which, if I assume correctly, was not the case during the Gilded Age, or was it? Or just how does those two differences play out, if they do?
Well, I mean, do you have an example? I'm trying to think of.
Well, for example, like, economic, like just today in the New York Times, they announced that there's a effort to set a corporate tax floor across all the G7 countries. So that is something that affects not just our economics, our tax policies, but it affects a global connection, which I'm not sure was the kind of thing that's going on in the Gilded Age.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly people, the idea of globalization, each generation always kids themselves about like certain things that are new. Globalization goes back to the 17th century for the US. But in the late 19th century, American corporations and really do go global. There's a great image I show, and when I talk about this, I think it shows the world and the Singer sewing machine kind of rotating around the world, and it's indicating what is true, that the Singer sewing machine is being sold in India. It's being sold all across Europe. So globalized business and globalized business interests are flourishing in the late 19th century, but there's no. I mean, I'm sure people are talking about, these questions, but there's no mechanism like, the G7 or the United Nations to try to set some sort of global, rules of the global economy. The only thing that does exist is tariff policy, and that's, trade treaties between different countries. But it's a lot. I'd say that's one of those things that's quite different from the late 19th and now early 21st century.
So I don't know if we have any more questions in the chat, but I think maybe it's a good time to ask Veronica to come back on. I think she has a few words to say, but I just want to say, Professor O'Donnell, this was fabulous. It's just so fascinating and so interesting, and actually very relevant to our area around Irvington, where Jay Gould lives half a mile away. Cyrus Field lived 100 yards from my house. It's just amazing. So it's just great. So Veronica, maybe you can come back on. I think you got a few comments to do, and then we'll finish up.
Yeah, certainly. And again, thank you to Professor O'Donnell for this wonderful lecture. And we hope you do come back soon for an encore. We're looking forward to it.